All right, Minnesota Wild. Let's go. Let's talk about the Wild. They're in a really weird scenario. They're going through a rough patch right now. I kind of want to talk about it. I think this recent stretch of games is a little more indicative of the team as a whole. They're a good team. They're still in the playoffs. They're in the second wild card position. It's a very tight race. Calgary is one. They're below the Wild. They have 58 points, as do the Wild, but the Calgary Flames have played one more game, so they lose that tiebreaker. However, the Colorado Avalanche also have 58 points and hold the third division spot in the Central. They've played one less game than the Wild, so they have the tiebreaker for that. So you got three teams with the same amount of points and just a couple of games difference. It's getting tight. It's getting close. The Avalanche are trending up. The Flames have a lot of potential to trend up, and so do the Wild. So it could be a very interesting run to race the playoffs. But let's talk about it. They've lost their 6 of their last 8 games, and the 2 wins they had were both not in regulation. It was one overtime winner against the Philadelphia Flyers and one shootout against Buffalo. They played well both these games. The game against Philly was super physical, a lot of fights, really close, low-scoring game. That was good. But the rest of the games haven't really been super close. Let's talk about it. These are their current lines. Obviously, we've seen some lines jumbled up. Steele sometimes plays on that first line. I think Hartman's been back there recently. But you got Kaprizov, Hartman, Zuccarello, Freddie Gaudreau, Sam Steele. Sometimes they swap wing to center. With Matt Boldy on that second line. Third line, however you want to look at it, you got Foligno, Erickson, Ek, Greenway, the absolute shutdown line. You got Duhaime, Dewar, and Reeves or Mason Shaw on that fourth line. Honestly, I think it's one of the better fourth lines in the league, and with Duhaime, Reeves, Shaw, you get a little bit of physicality too that they can offer. Dewar, one of the better penalty killers in the league. He is very good defensively. Defense, you got Middleton, Spurgeon, second line Brodin, Dumba, and third line either Merrill or Goligoski on that left defense side with Kalen Addison on that right. Goaltending, you have Fleury, still the starting goaltender, and Gustafsson, still the backup goaltender. I guess I'm going to start with their goaltending because Fleury hasn't been Fleury. He hasn't been great. You can see there's a lot of frustration with him in his own game. Not just the players, the fans, but I think nobody's more frustrated than Fleury himself, and it shows. And you kind of feel bad. Dude's 38. He's not too off from league average, but if this team wants to be a playoff team, they need to do a little better than league average, especially in the Central with teams like, Colorado. Fleury has a .902 save percentage. The league average is .906. Save percentage league-wide hasn't been that low since the 06-07 season. So it's a little indicative that we're not seeing goaltenders put up remarkable numbers. There are a few exceptions. You got Shesterkin last year. You got Ullmark this year. But in general, goaltending, it's been tougher over the years. This is because it's become a more skilled game. Teams are focusing more on offense than defense. Even their defense has become a lot more offensive and higher scoring, generating much more quality shots on goaltenders. As a result, we've seen save percentage decrease league-wide. Fleury is no exception to that. His goals against is 2.98 goals against per game. It's a pretty high number. You'll like to see low to mid twos. That's a very, very good number. Around 3 is not so good, but league average is 2.94. So Fleury, slightly worse than league average in both of these categories. Not terrible, though. Gustafsson, on the other hand, has looked great. He reminds me very much of Linus Ullmark last year. He'll play very solid. An entire game, he'll play very solid. He'll make the tough saves when you need it. Coming down the stretch, he'll make highlight reel saves. He's an incredible goaltender. But at least once a game, there's always that one goal he lets in that's always like, probably shouldn't have let that in. Kind of a questionable goal. Now, Ullmark has cleaned that up in his game this year and is one of the best goaltenders, if not the best goaltender in the league, which speaks volume to his game. Gustafsson's right there with him. but he needs to shore up that one iffy goal that goes in a game that probably shouldn't go in. One of the, it's typically a softer goal, probably a long range wrist shot with no screen or something along those lines. That typical, you'd expect a goaltender to save. But Gustafsson's been good, but he's only 24 years old. He's a young kid, and he's playing great in a backup role. But young goaltenders, you typically want to have sheltered minutes. You want to have them develop the right way. You want to be able to work on their, I don't really want to say weaknesses, but you want to work on their non-strengths, their development opportunities, if you will, before the rest of the league catches on, right? You get a goaltender playing a bunch of minutes, Carter Hart, for example. Next year, teams have a book on all their weaknesses, and sometimes it's more than one weakness that can be exploited by an opposing team. And that's tough for a goaltender to catch up, and it can take years for a goaltender to catch up and really adjust to that in real time, especially when they're being relied on so much. So as a young goaltender, typically, and this isn't the case with some teams and some goaltenders, but the Wild are taking a conservative approach with Gustafsson. They got Jesper Wallstedt down in the AHL, playing out of his mind lately. Really the last few months he's been unbelievable down there. Taking their time with the goaltenders, as you should. That's just it's just what you should do. So I don't really have an issue with Gustafsson playing less. I know people would like to see Gustafsson play more, but this could be the future goaltender of the Wild, the potential franchise goaltender. Develop him right. You're a fringe playoff team at the moment. You have this is year 1 of 3 of really severe cap buyout penalties from the Parise Suter contracts. So let's talk about kind of their needs at the moment. Defensive depth. I think that goes hand in hand with goaltending. I don't think goaltending's entirely to blame, but I don't think the defense is entirely to blame either. Both have played good, probably about league average. Defense, probably a little better than league average. Fleury, probably a little worse than his numbers would tell you. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, Fleury, still an NHL caliber goaltender. The defense has had their issues. They've had some injuries. Dumba probably on the block, probably being like most definitely on the block. But the third defensive line for the Wild is a concern when it comes to defensive play. You have Calen Addison, young, great goal scorer. He's an offensive defenseman. He still has a long way to go to work on his defense. He's come a long way since the beginning of the season. It shows game in and game out. He's grown leaps and bounds in his defensive game, but there's still a long way to go. So you got to pair him up with a good defensive defenseman. Your two options really are John Merrill and Alex Goligoski, both of which have good, solid games, but there are games more often than not where it's one of the sketchier defensive pairings, I think, in the league when it comes to playing defense. The offense is there with this line. There's no question about that. Addison gets most of his points on the power play, but even when they're not in the power play, all three of these guys drive into the offensive zone and create scoring chances. So there's something to be said about that. But when it comes to their defensive play, it's, how much defense are you getting with these guys? So that, for me, is a big concern. And I think that's partly indicative of Fleury's numbers as well. Brodin's also going to need a partner on that right defensive side when Dumba goes at the deadline, which he presumably should. So there are questions. If this team wants to progress and be a playoff team this year, there's going to be things they need to address, but they also need to keep in mind that the cap penalty goes up $2 million next year and stays that into the year after as well. So they have to plan ahead for that. The cap may only go up by $1 million, so in reality, you may be decreasing $1 million of cap space of what they currently have, which is around $3.7 million. So there's that as well. The next thing is the second line or third line, or however, we typically refer to the Boldy line as the second line, but it varies depending on the night. This line is a bit of a concern. So you got Matt Boldy. He's I think he's like 21. He's a goal scorer. He has something like 40-something points in 51 games or something. Durable, big guy, can play physical, though more of a skill guy. Very good defensive winger as well. and that's great. But they're still trying to fill that Fiala void. They just are. Last year, Fiala, Boldy, and Gaudreau centering that line showed you don't need an elite centerman to center that line. Just as the Zuccarello-Kaprizov line, they've had Steele up there. I guess that's really it for the most part. I don't remember if they've had anyone else up in that center line. I think Eriksson Ek played up there, but yeah, I don't know. But, Hartman's stats increase. Steele stats increase significantly. Gaudreau's stats increase when he was on that second line with Boldy, Fiala last year. Gaudreau, great two-way centerman / winger. He can play both. He does play both. He's very good. But they need another scoring guy to supplement Boldy, whether it's a goal scorer or a playmaker. Boldy's one of those guys that can pass, but he can also shoot, and he's got a very nice pass and a very nice shot. So take your pick. You got options. And it doesn't even matter if you have a winger or a center. Either way, you got one guy that can come back, play defense when you need to, and you have two forwards rushing the offensive zone. That is what we saw work very well for this line, and this is typically Dean Evanson's system. The first line, for example, you got Kaprizov, Zuccarello typically driving into the O zone with Hartman lagging behind, typically on the more defensive side of the puck. You see that with Greenway typically lagging in the zone. You see that with Dewar typically lagging in the zone, right? Excuse me. But you need that second scorer on that line to really bump up your offense. The offense has been struggling during this losing stretch quite a bit. You'll get a point per game for the Hartman, Zuccarello, Kaprizov line, or Steele, Zuccarello, Kaprizov line, whatever. And you might get like a goal from Eriksson Ek because he's having an outstanding offensive season for a defensive first centerman. But there are concerns that need to be addressed, and these aren't little concerns. You need a top six forward, right? It can be a winger, can be a center. Doesn't really matter. Wingers are probably a little cheaper on the market to get a hold of. But you need a top six forward. You're going to need a second line defenseman at the very least, and probably some depth in defense. Probably a defensive defenseman who can play third line minutes. But those are the questions. Do you go for it? Do you have to elevate Gustafsson's minutes? Is that the guy you play in the playoffs? My answer, as somebody who enjoys watching the Wild, I watch nearly every single Wild game, would be no. I think you kind of leave as is. You start planning for the next couple of years. I think as Wild fans, it's understood that these 3 years are going to be tough. They're probably not going to be Stanley Cup seasons, and that's okay. If they do, great. But I consider it a success if this team makes the playoffs with the cap restraints they have. But they've done a very nice job planning for the future, getting one of the best prospect pools in the league. They have a bunch of guys in the AHL they can call up if they need to that are overperforming in the AHL. Probably NHL ready guys that need a little bit of experience. They've done a nice job developing these younger guys. They're not in bad shape for the future, and once that cap penalty decreases by like $13 million, they're going to have a lot more cap space to make this team competitive. They're going to have a lot of young good contracts on the team, entry-level contracts, that can help the Wild make a playoff and Stanley Cup run. So do you plan to win a Stanley Cup in a few years, or do you try to make a push this year and next year and the year after, and maybe deplete some of your prospect pool, your resources? That's the big question. I don't really know there's any answer. I think most fans would say they want to see the Wild push for a Stanley Cup this year. I'm on the other end of that. I'm on the fence. I think it's okay if they sell some of their pieces. It's okay if they miss the playoffs. It's okay if they get a better first-round pick, right, and a better second-round pick. I'm watching NHL Network right now, and there's a fight on TV, and it's Delorier. He was on the Wild last year, and Tanner Jeannot. But so that's my perspective. I'd be okay if they didn't push too hard this year. They didn't sell off too many pieces, too many assets. But let me know what you guys think. This is kind of a big trade deadline for the Wild and could be very indicative of what we can expect, not just this year, but the following 2 years after. Are we going to see this team start preparing for the future? And not so much a rebuild, but maybe a little bit of a retool, a little just understanding that with the cap constraints, it's extremely difficult to put a Stanley Cup team together, and just realizing that. Are we going to see them try to make the playoffs, try to push for it the next few years? I think they're going to be okay with being one of those fringe teams. Personally, probably make a wild card position this year and the following 2 years. And this is just, things can change in a snap in the NHL with a team. This is just prediction, but I think they're all right being a fringe playoff team. You get those, whatever it's called, sales and playoff stuff, and that's great, and that helps the team's revenue and profit margins and all that stuff. Makes the fans kind of engaged, like this team could be good. We're only a couple pieces away. And then once the cap penalties ride out, go all out and spend and make your best effort to win a Stanley Cup. So it's interesting. I don't really know. If you're a Wild fan, let me know what you think, what you want to see this team do at the trade deadline, what you want to see happen with this team. Remember, this is only year one of 3 years of a pretty hefty buyout penalty. For me, honestly, I think it's already been a win in terms of Bill Guerin and what he's been able to do with this roster, with this team, to navigate through these buyout penalties. The prospect pool is leaps and bounds way better than it was before Bill Guerin got there. They have a good team with a lot of young kids that show a lot of promise for the future. They're taking risks on getting guys like signing Sam Steele, trading for Ryan Reeves, who wasn't doing so hot this year from the Rangers, and making these guys important pieces into the lineup, everyday pieces. That acquisition of Jake Middleton, signing a cheaper contract extension to get through this buyout period. Top line guy, he's playing top line minutes with Spurgeon. Probably more of a top four defenseman, but nonetheless, he's looked very good on that top line with Spurgeon. Oh, and can drop the gloves if you need him to, right? So I think Bill Guerin's done a wonderful job to this point. I'm curious to see what else he has in store, but this trade deadline is going to be very indicative as to the next few years of the Wild, as to what kind of team they're going to be. So that's all I got. I just want to talk about the Wild, their losing streak, because there are concerns. There are plenty of concerns. You have a lot of guys from last year having career years too, and in terms not just offensively but defensively as well. And I think that speaks volumes to Dean Evason and his coaching. I'm very satisfied with the job Dean Evason, his staff, the coaching staff, and the front office has done with this team. I don't think it's been an easy job by any means, but I'm pretty confident in these guys. I'm not hoping to see a change in any of those positions anytime soon. Again, let me know what you think. You live in Minnesota. Maybe you talk more Wild hockey than I get to talk, but let me know. I appreciate your thoughts. That's it for this. Thank you guys for watching. Take care, all right?